Do your thing. All right, welcome to Federalist Society. Thank you all so much for being here. I am going to briefly go over our wonderful speakers' bios. And of course, thank you, Professor Segall, for being here. No, it's a really good bio. We got to go over it. But this is the wonderful Josh Blackman, Professor of Law at Houston College of Law. He specializes in constitutional law and the intersection of law and technology. Josh is the author of the critically acclaimed, Unprecedented, The Constitutional Challenge of Obamacare, and his new book that just came out. Be sure to ask him about it.
And buy a copy.
Yes, and buy a copy. It's on Amazon. It's called Unraveled, and it's Obamacare, Religious Liberty, and Executive Power. Just to snag a copy of that. He has testified twice before the House Judiciary Committee on the constitutionality of executive action on immigration and healthcare. He's an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. He's also the president of the Harlan Institute, the founder of Fantasy SCOTUS, which is so much fun. And also, he blogs at joshblackman.com. He's great on Twitter.
I'm tweeting this debate as we speak.
Sometimes these two get out. I highly recommend. And he's also been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, USA Today, LA Times, other national publications. I recommend going to his blog and reading his full bio because it's quite impressive. I'm going to give a very brief bio on Professor Segall. You guys know he's awesome. For 2 federal judges, then he went to work in the private sector as well as the United States Justice Department. Before joining our faculty in 1991, he's written over 20 law review articles, all about constitutional law, as well as his book, Supreme Myths, Why the Supreme Court is Not a Court, and it's just he is frequently on radio shows, number of podcasts. I've been listening to podcasts before, and all of a sudden he's there talking to me. It's quite magical. And also numerous online articles. He's very well published, very well respected. So I'm so glad to have all of you. I'm not going to read our full mission statement today, but I recommend you all go to our website or pick up a pocket constitution
and read it. And don't just read the entire thing cover to cover.
It's awesome.
It is awesome.
And we have free ones,
yes,
which is like a law student dream. Yeah.
Thank you, Susan. That is by far the most enthusiastic introduction I've ever had. So this is the right tone for our event. Thank you again. It's my 4th time at Georgia State. I'm always sparring over Eric, who's my good friend and nemesis. On depending how the day goes. We have lunch after this, but today will be no holds barred. Our focus today is on the election and the Supreme Court. What we do is sketch out at a high level what the upcoming election means for the justices, how Justice Scalia's vacancy affected the court last term, this term, in the future, and in the long term. So to begin with, we have a somewhat unorthodox presidential election, and that is putting it mildly. On the Republican side, Donald Trump, a businessman, has taken an unprecedented step. It's the list of now nearly 20 individuals that he would put on the Supreme Court to fill Justice Scalia's vacancy. These members, by and large, are card-carrying Federal Society members. Another perk of membership, I suppose. Maybe you'll wind up on Donald's shortlist. They're all fairly conservative. They all have textualism and originalism as their groundings of jurisprudence. Importantly, and I think this is an important point, they're not from the D.C. establishment, and Trump has made this point implicitly. You don't have people like a Paul Clement or Brett Kavanaugh from the D.C. Circuit or the D.C. establishment. These are people from what Scalia calls the vast in-between, right, between the coasts. In fact, only one judge from Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh is a coastal. So this is somewhat novel. On the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton has not released a list. In fact, no one has ever done this before. Instead, Clinton has issued what she calls litmus tests. Now, what is a litmus test? Everyone remember a swimming pool, right? You put the little piece of paper in the pool, depending on how acid it changes colors. A litmus test is asking a judge, how will you vote on case X? And the classic litmus test is, how will you vote on Roe against Wade? There's a ethical issue with litmus tests, which is this. Once a judge articulates how he or she will vote in a case, Eric and I disagree on this vociferously. But generally speaking, when a judge says, hey, I think Roe v. Wade is correct or incorrect, and the case comes up, they have to recuse. So judges tend not to say how they'll vote. Clinton has made a point saying that she would want to appoint justices who reverse Citizens United. Now, in the Constitution, get rid of Citizens United. You know what's easier than an amendment? 2/3 2/3 of the states, 3/4 of the states. You confirm one justice, you get a 5th vote. Citizens United goes bye-bye. But it was an explicit litmus test. Her surrogates have made this point clear. Okay, so now let's move on. In the event that Trump wins the election, I who the hell knows that he picked someone from that list. In that case, the court will more or less stay where it is. You're replacing Scalia with someone who's fairly conservative, maybe a little bit to the left, maybe a little bit to the right, so that Trump's pick would more or less keep the court where it is. The remainder of my talk will talk about what happens if Clinton wins, because that would, for the first time in several decades, democratically appointed justice in the court. Now, you see in the media, this will be the first time there are 5 liberals in the court in decades. Justice Stevens was a Ford appointee, became consistently liberal. Justice Blackmun was a Nixon appointee, became consistently liberal. Justice Souter was a Bush nominee, was consistently liberal. Even Justice O'Connor and Kennedy, both Reagan nominees, were always flip-flopping left to right. At a 5 liberal vote block for some time, depending on the given issue. Abortion, yes. Gay marriage, but not for Federalist cases. First time, though, you actually have 5 democratically appointed justices, and that would be a stark reminder. Why? It doesn't matter anymore, right? For decades, Eric and I have been arguing, how do we get Kennedy to vote in our case? He's irrelevant. Even Breyer, as the 5th median justice, and he's a guy that you have to swing, which is not going to be too difficult. So last year and into this year, we've already had the feeling of Justice Scalia's absence being felt. And this is felt most distinctly with respect to what are called stays. When a lower court issues an injunction saying you have to do this now, people often go to the Court of Appeals saying, hey, put this on hold, we don't want to. On the Supreme Court, to get a stay, to go to lower court order on hold, you only need 4 votes for certiorari, but you need 5 votes for a stay. So in a number of cases, there have been 4 votes, but not 5. I'll give you a couple examples. In the voting ID cases, right? All the cases where states have tried to impose voting ID requirements. You've had 4 votes to put on hold the lower court orders blocking these laws. We didn't have 5, so Scalia's vote was felt there. United States against Texas, the immigration case. Maybe we'll talk about it later. The court split 4-4. The injunction in the Texas court blocking President Obama's immigration plan stays on hold. Issue was the last case Justice Scalia ruled on, which was a Clean Power Plan, right? This is President Obama's massive environmental regulation. 5 justices to put that on hold. Scalia died about a week later. So that was his last act as a justice. We'll take it from there. Okay, let me move on to this term. Scalia's absence will not be too profound because for the most part, the justices have shied away from controversial cases. There haven't been many big cases granted so far. In fact, one of the only big blockbusters hasn't even been scheduled for argument. This is a case called Trinity Lutheran, and the case involves a playground in Missouri that's associated with the church. And this playground applied for a grant from the state to get rubber chips. You know, playgrounds with little rubber chips so kids don't crack their skulls. You know, it seems like a decent idea. So this church playground applied for this rubber chip program, and the state said, no, we can't do that. Our Constitution prohibits funding church organizations, you know, separation of church and state, I suppose. So that's one of the biggest cases that's been granted. They have not yet scheduled for argument. They're saying, whoops, let's just hold on to this one and wait till we get 9, not 8, 9. Another big case that they have granted for this term, which will come up, is involving specifically offensive trademarks. So you all know the football team in Washington, the Washington Redskins. They've actually had a case saying, can we cancel their trademark because that phrase is offensive? What it took, though, was not about the Redskins, was about an Asian rock band called the Slants. You can use your imagination how they got that name. These Slants are now arguing that they have a First Amendment right to use their trademark, and the court will grant this case. 2 other cases that may come up this year that Scalia's absence we felt involved the Clean Power Plan. This is, again, this sort of climate change regulations, and also the net neutrality case. This is the idea of whether Verizon or Comcast can charge additional money to certain types of traffic over their network. Administrative law cases that may come up to a shorthanded court. But that's boring. Let's look in the short term. And I'll assume it's Garland or maybe someone else like Garland. Frankly, it doesn't matter. If you look where Garland falls on the spectrum, he's not that much different than Ginsburg or Sotomayor or Breyer. On the cases that count, they all vote the same way. In fact, as a libertarian, Garland is the worst case scenario because he's pro-police. Two good things I like about liberal justice is they actually have a civil libertarian streak. Garland lacks that. He's extremely deferential to the state at every turn. He'd be like Breyer's best bud. They'll be voting together in all these cases. Whether or not he gets on, it doesn't matter. What sort of precedents are at risk? And I think the number one on the chopping block is Citizens United. This has become a cause célèbre on the left. Case ever, right? Politics, money, they find a way no matter what. I don't care if it's Citizens United, Buckley Vallejo, whatever case you find, you will find ways of getting money to politics. It doesn't matter. Really doesn't matter what mechanism you've used. Money will get in. It's irrelevant. So I don't really care about Citizens United. I think it's an overrated case, but liberals hate it, so they're going to try to overturn it. Go down. You might have a local state government that tries to enact a ban on independent expenditures, and that just tees up the case, right? You don't even need any federal action to tee up the case. Like California, be a laboratory of democracy, campaign finance. And RBG and others said very clearly this case is gone, so I fully expect Citizens United to be overruled. Precedent that I think will be on the chopping blocks, but not quite, is involving the Second Amendment. The case of District of Columbia versus Heller. This is a case where the Supreme Court said that you have a right to bear arms. But that is all they said. You only have the right to bear arms in your home. Now, I don't think the court will be so keen on overturning Heller because that will lead to a massive backlash of people, doing bad things. I think the more likely scenario is a 5-4 decision saying, hey, protects the right to keep a gun in your house. Get a handgun in your house. Everything else is good. No carry outside the home. No right to an AR-15. No right to a large magazine. Overturn a single precedent. All they have to say is that this right is limited to the home. And frankly, that would not disturb much. Heller, only 2 jurisdictions in the United States ban gun ownership at home, DC and Chicago. This sort of regime would basically let all the states continue to violate our Second Amendment rights, and they'll simply look the other way and make it a dead letter. That would effectively end litigation in the Second Amendment. Far more likely a scenario. I am not too happy about it. I think that's likely what's going to happen. Another area that I think will be ripe for change is the death penalty. And this is more of a longer term shift. Justices Breyer and Ginsburg have now signaled that they think the death penalty is in all of its manifestations unconstitutional. We see this with cases involving solitary confinement and other things short of death. Why I think this one is actually probably more potent is public opinion of the death penalty have dropped. I read a poll the other day that said for the first time in decades, support for the death penalty dropped below 50%. You're starting to see governors, issue commutations and states repeal the death penalty. I don't think the death penalty is too long for this world, maybe in Texas and other places, but I think we'll start seeing it trickle out. And frankly, the amount of effort that goes into legislating the death penalty is not worth it. Volunteer to stop to stop executions. If they use their efforts elsewhere to help actually, people commit crimes they didn't commit, right, vital benefit. Eric's nodding, so I'm happy. So I don't think the death penalty is long for this world. I think it'd be a net positive to get rid of it because, frankly, it's a waste of time. It's such a waste of time and money. Let that money be spent elsewhere for public defenders on the street. You get a guy picked up for a drug crime. Put the money towards him, right? Someone who actually rehabilitates their life, not an actual murderer who did it. So all these people are guilty, right? These are bad stuff. Okay. Another area that I think we'll see a shift is involving administrative law. Now, there's a doctrine called Chevron, which you've probably studied. The idea is if Congress passes a statute that has an ambiguous term and the agency takes an interpretation that's not absolutely insane, that is reasonable, courts will defer to that interpretation. In the last couple of years, Justice Scalia, who was a big supporter of Chevron, has had second givings about it. He's had second thoughts about it. Maybe that's because now we have a Democratic president relying on it, whatever it is. Whatever. He had a second coming. I was never a fan of Chevron. It was Bush or Reagan, whoever else. It was no good. Violation of separation of powers. But I think the short answer is whatever movement there was to peel back the Chevron doctrine, I think is done. We live in an era of gridlock. I have a piece in the Harvard Law Review called Gridlock. We don't pass laws anymore, right? Social change happens through dear colleague letters and rulemakings and guidance memorandums from various agencies. We'll be all too content to defer to whatever President Clinton's Department of Blah would like to do. Efforts to peel back on Chevron, or what's called our deference, AUER, I think are not long for this world. Okay? In my remaining few minutes, I'll turn to Eric in a bit. I want to talk about some of the long-term changes, right? These are the, not like 1, 2 years, I mean 5, 10 years. And with predictions, you're always wrong, so I'm sure I'll be wrong in this one. But one thing I can say we're already seeing is a shift. Liberals have played a game of keep away, right? They've tried to keep big cases away from the Supreme Court where they thought they would lose. For example, with collective bargaining and labor and union dues, right? They've been keeping these cases away from the court for years. Fair housing, they've been keeping these cases away from the years. Conservatives, right? Second Amendment, First Amendment, take it, take it, take it. It's time to be flipped. It's already happening. Sue the bastards, right? Let's go. Let's bring these cases up. Let's get these things teed up and let's make change. And conservatives will say, let's calm down. Let's not be rushed. Let's file briefs in opposition to cert. From my perspective, if there's a fifth liberal justice, the point of writing amicus briefs now for me becomes a waste of time. I've written so many briefs saying, hey, Justice Kennedy, federalism, right? Liberty. That's no longer relevant. Well, I tell Justice Breyer, hey, Justice Breyer, Kardashian theft, right? No, hey, Justice Breyer, let's make democracy work better. I don't know what the hell the argument has to be, but it becomes, I think, a waste of time. Second big liberal pipe dream that I think we'll see is known as positive rights. Okay, this has been a fantasy of the left for as long as I can. The idea limits government, but it gives you a right. So, for example, a right to education, right? You give you a right to a quality education. Now, some of the state constitutions have those provisions, but our federal constitution does not. And you're already seeing litigation being filed by various groups saying that lack of funding in schools is not only bad policy, but unconstitutional. You now put schools under federal court receivership. That federal courts can now decide whether there's adequate funding. That's insane. Look at New Jersey. There was a decision called Abbott some decades ago where the New Jersey Supreme Court said, we decide whether schools have enough funding. Courts invalidating budgets that have passed through both houses of the New Jersey Congress and signed by the governor. In fact, Chris Christie threatened to ignore the Supreme Court in New Jersey a couple of years ago. He ultimately caved, right? Because the bridge folds or whatever happens to be. I think we'll see a shifting of the law involves voting rights. Now, we already have, even though the Voting Rights Act is not really in play as it was before, courts are treating it the same way, right? If jurisdictions engage in sort of racial discrimination, they're fine of striking down these laws. But it's not just racial discrimination, as it were. There's something called political or partisan gerrymandering, and you've seen these, right? Districts that are drawn to basically maximize Democrat members of Congress, you know what these look like, these little salamander things that squiggle around the state. For years, courts invalidate these political gerrymanders, right? Politicians love it, keeps them in office. So I do think that we move into try and strike down maps, not because they're racially discriminatory, because they disenfranchise or they're drawn in a way to rig party politics. I never get into these maps. I think that the people drawing them are probably really smart. But as Justice Frankfurter said some decades ago, this is a political thicket of some depth, and perhaps we should stay out of it. Picking up Eric and getting a little blood in the water of what the lasting impact will be of textualism and originalism now that Justice Scalia is not here. Justice Scalia's main pissing off now, right? Justice Scalia's main contribution has been to focus on the text and history. Oh, he's chomping at the bit. Will this persist when Scalia is gone? I will give only one anecdote. Scalia would not cite legislative history. If there was an opinion by the majority that cited legislative history, he would dissent from that one sentence. You'd obviously, Scalia does not join this sentence, right? That was his thing. But for better or worse, judges and the justices stop citing legislative history as much. And maybe they do once in a while, but also, no, they'll simply go for it. This past term, there were a couple unanimous decisions that had legislative history cited in it. Isn't of the same stripe. So I think we'll start seeing more focus on purpose and history as other malleable sources, and Justice Scalia's rigorous textualism, I think will always be with us, but will not be as strictly enforced. And I'm going to give Eric some rejoinder, and then we'll come up here later and yell about it. Thank you so much. Remember, stand in front of the camera. He yelled at me. Last time I had him on camera, he was walking around.
I have to walk and gesticulate. Yeah. Thanks, Josh. It is always great to have Josh here. He is truly one of our young stars in constitutional law in this country, and always entertaining. I'm usually way behind the 8 ball because you normally have a PowerPoint presentation that makes it easier for me. I'm going to respond to a few of the things that Josh said, but I agree with most of it. On most of what you said today, did you say there's a camera here? I have a couple quibbles, but then I have bigger fish to fry. So I will, on Garland and what he may or may not do as Supreme Court Justice, I'd be very careful about making predictions. It is true that in the Court of Appeals, he has been reasonably liberal, except when it comes to criminal procedure, where he's been more conservative than Justice Scalia. That might continue or might not, but here's the thing, and it's part of how I think about constitutional law. There's a huge difference between giving a governmental official a lot of power for life and giving a governmental official unreviewable power for life. That changes their perspectives. And of course, if he gets to the Supreme Court, he will have unreviewable power for life, and that could change a lot of things, as we've seen with Blackmun and Souter and White, and a bunch of other justices. So I would just be cautious. Josh and I would agree on is, by all accounts, Garland is a man of great credibility and wisdom and fairness and has had a stellar career. So that's what I hope we'd agree on that. I agree about Citizens United. Mostly, I would like to see it narrowed a little bit. I don't know if it'll be reversed. Certainly a liberal court will narrow it tremendously. Agree everything you said about Heller, except it would be great if what Josh predicted is going to happen would happen. We don't need judges in Georgia and Alaska and South Carolina overseeing the balance between gun safety and gun rights. That should be a local issue. The Supreme Court should not be involved. Judges should not be involved. As a historical matter, we all know the Second Amendment has nothing to do with self-defense in the home or hunting. So that issue should be reserved to the states. But I do agree a liberal court would not overturn Heller, but would limit it to its facts, and then I would be very happy. The death penalty, I agree with everything you said. There is no chance in any of almost no chance in any of your lifetimes that the Supreme Court of the United States will find positive rights in our Constitution. That might be a liberal fantasy. It is just a fantasy. It will not happen absent some kind of cataclysmic change in American culture. So if conservatives are going to worry about this liberal court, that is one issue they do not need to worry about. There has never been 1.5 justices who believe positive rights come out of our Constitution, unless they're gun rights, then they believe in it. And finally,
shall make no law infringing the right.
As to Justice Scalia, I agree, and I have written many times, that off the court, he focused dramatically on text and history. In Atlanta 2 years ago, he gave a talk where he gesticulated like Ralph Cramden on The Honeymooners. You may not get that reference. Saying, I know, it's sad, saying the Constitution is dead, dead, dead. And he certainly said that off the court, but on the court, he was as activist and aggressive a judge turning laws as any liberal justice in history. He did it all the time and almost never based on text and history, but that's not today's discussion. We can do that some other time. But I agree about legislative history. I think that he was successful in reducing the use of legislative history. His success there will end with his death. But I do think that's going to be a big change. All right, I want to talk about something else that is extremely important at this moment in time. We have an 8-justice Supreme Court, and for the first time in history, it is evenly divided among 4 liberals and 4 conservatives 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, and the most liberal Republican, Justice Kennedy, is more conservative than the most conservative Democrat, Justice Breyer. Now, it is true that there are some flips, Kennedy on gay rights, and a few other issues, on abortion has moved to the left, but he is a reliable conservative vote in something like 80% of the 5-4 cases that he has been the 5th judge on. Justice Breyer is a very reliable liberal vote, with the exception of a few criminal procedure cases and an affirmative action case here or there. So we have an equally divided 4-4 liberal conservative court, and virtually the entire media, my friends at the New York Times and Slate, and everybody says this is terrible, this is awful. The official slogan of the American Constitution Society, which I'm in Georgia, is "We need 9." No, we don't. Not only do we not need 9 justices, we emphatically don't need 9 justices. We should freeze the situation and forever have a 4-4 among Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, Supreme Court. Our country would be way better off if we made this permanent. Pros of that approach, address a couple cons, suggest it could happen. I have about 10 minutes to do all that. Here we go. A 4-4 evenly divided Supreme Court will do much less. It just will. And we saw this last term. To win a case in the Supreme Court, in a case that involves political stakes, and many don't, but in a case that involves ideological stakes, you have to convince a Republican to vote with the Democrats or a Democrat to vote with the Republican. Hard. But that's what it should take. Because remember what the fundamental question is in every constitutional law case ever brought to the Supreme Court since 1787. We want 5 or more judges sitting in the nation's capital to impose a national rule on all 50 states and hundreds of millions of American people. That's the question. Is this whatever rule is being challenged? Is this something Arkansas can do, or the Congress can do, or Alaska can do, or are 5 judges going to say no, you can't? And it's my position that 5 judges should say no, you can't. Constitutional text and history are very clear.
Like abortion and gay marriage.
Like abortion and gay marriage is more difficult. I think Roe versus Wade is wrong. I met my wife through Planned Parenthood. I'm pro-choice all the way down. I'm long on record as saying Roe versus Wade is wrongly decided. In a country as polarized as ours right now, that with this congressional gridlock, with this partisan gridlock, the Supreme Court could and did last term set an excellent example of bipartisanship, narrowly, one step at a time, announcing national rules where one Republican is willing to vote with one Democrat or one Democrat with one Republican. From 1900 to 1936, 5 conservative, old guard, 19th century judges struck down over 200 laws involving minimum wages, union protections, child labor. Children worked in the factories and the mines for 15 years more than they should have, under terrible, gruesome conditions, because 5 out-of-touch Supreme Court justices imposed their will on the country. Not because the text said it, not because history said it, because they could. Justice Brennan said all the time, 50 years later, the most important rule in constitutional law is the number 5. We should trust Brennan. The most important rule in constitutional law, he told his law clerks, is the number 5. That's a bad system. To the extent there are many conservatives who think that the Warren Court went too far to the left in many different areas. Why did they do that? Not because of text, not because of history, because they could. In fact, at the turn of the century, there was a lot of literature, the 20th century, there was a lot of literature suggesting Supreme Court should not issue constitutional decisions with huge implications 5-4. And it is a bad idea. It is a bad idea. With 8 justices evenly divided, it has to be 5-3. Now, I've been talking a lot about this, and the pushback I always get, other than from people whose income depends on the Supreme Court being in the news every day,
Not naming names.
and then I'm willing to say that, the pushback I get is, but uniformity, Supreme Court making uniform national rules, otherwise there'll be chaos and have. No, it won't. Here's the data. 99.6% of all federal cases never get to the Supreme Court. 0.6% of all federal cases, there is no uniformity interest served by the Supreme Court of the United States. And we might have different rules in California and New York and Texas, the Supreme Court. Second, of the 75 cases the Supreme Court takes every year, give or take, 20% are 5-4. Of those 20% that are 5-4, historically, very few concerns. Now, people in Texas may disagree with people in New York and disagree with people in Oregon about how those, but that's not a uniformity concern. In fact, almost no constitution raise uniformity concerns. Cases involving antitrust law and securities law, where big government institutions, big corporate institutions have to, maybe there's a uniformity interest there. Those aren't the cases that divide 5-4. And here's the kicker. If the Supreme Court were to know that for the rest of time, we're evenly divided, they will find a way to use their power, because all governmental officials will, and will. And if uniformity is a huge issue, they will find a way to resolve the case. They just will. So the only downside of my proposal is the uniformity, but we already have 99.5% of cases where that interest doesn't even exist. When should 5 judges in Washington impose a national rule on all 50 states and 300 million or whatever it is American people? Damn rarely. And with a 4-4 court, it will be much rarer. Could this happen? Because even people who are sympathetic to my thesis, all 4 of them in the country, suggest that, well, even if you're right, it could never happen. And that's wrong. In fact, easily, and I predict, if Donald Trump should win and the Senate were to go Democrat, which is impossible, but or even if the Senate goes, or even if Trump wins, if Hillary wins and the Senate stays Republican, it would work, and here's why. The Senate has all kinds of informal rules involving nominations and other things that they have used voluntarily on a bipartisan basis for a century. The filibuster, that was a gentle person's agreement for 100 years. They just agreed to do it. Right now, as we sit here, there's something called the blue slip procedure. If a person is nominated from Georgia to be a lower court federal judge, and 99 senators agree this person should be a judge, but 1 senator from Georgia does not agree, give the chair of the Judiciary Committee a blue slip. A senator from Georgia, a nominee from Georgia, never gets a vote. 100. That is done by voluntary, gentle person's agreement by the Senate. So here's the scenario. The Senate Majority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader, whoever they are, and they say the following. The President of the United States can send anyone he wants over, or she wants over, can send anyone they want over. The President's prerogative. We can't tell the President who to nominate. We're not going to approve them unless they are the same political party who retired or died. And that's what we're going to do from now on. And the Senate has an absolute constitutional privilege to do that. I assume you'd agree with that.
I've been making this point for years.
Yeah, so they absolutely could do that. And look at the bipartisan. They raised their hands. Look how great we are. We're going to have an equal Supreme Court for the rest of time. That is actually in the long-term interests of Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, the House of Representatives, the President of the United States, and all 50 states. Interest, because that will lead to a much weaker Supreme Court by definition. If you're a member of the Senate, you're not going to be too upset about a much weaker. It's not a useless Supreme Court, though. There are all those 80% of the cases that are not 5-4. Those cases don't change. And where the Constitution is clear and the history is obvious, the court should step in if majorities in a given time period do something that is clearly inconsistent with the Constitution. But that's not our country. In areas of abortion, gun law, affirmative action, federalism, separation of powers, I could go on and on and on, is get to impose their will for no reason other than they want to. Unelected judges to do that, should be very, very rare. I'll close with this. Ever since, I would say, around 1960 or so, when a law professor at Harvard named Alexander Bickel started talking about the counter-majoritarian difficulty. That was when the court strikes down an act of Congress or the states, you have unelected life tenured governmental officials striking down the acts of elected governmental officials. And he created this whole of legal theorists trying to figure out how can we come up with a method of interpretation of judges, because he was worried about judicial power. And this led to formalism and originalism and textualism and then representation reinforcing by liberals and all these other academic theories, none of which have ever worked and will ever work. Scalia and Thomas are as aggressive as any liberals when it comes to overturning law. The only thing that can work to rein in the judiciary is an institutional change. Taking away life tenure wouldn't be a bad thing, but that would require a constitutional amendment.
Not necessarily.
For sake of argument, it would require a constitutional amendment. The Senate has an absolute constitutional prerogative to implement my proposal. It would dramatically weaken the power of the Supreme Court. Liberals, conservatives, libertarians, and all American citizens would benefit as a result. So we decide if Josh sat and I stood, we'd be the same height. But he's not moving.
I've actually been making this point that Eric's been making for a couple of years. 2012 Republican convention, Clint Eastwood was pointing at an empty chair. Remember that? I call this Clint Eastwood effect, where I fully expected that if Justice Ginsburg left the court and the Senate and it was President Clinton, they would block anyone. We're having basically in reverse, where I think it's going to be Clinton nominates someone, Republicans will hold the Senate, they'll say, screw you. Entirely, there's no obligation on the Senate to do anything at all. At all. None. And they can say, we are rejecting Garland because we don't like his use on guns, we don't like this or that. There's nothing you can do. I don't think there's any way to stop that. I think we will have a shorthanded Supreme Court. The one wrinkle, though, that's worth mentioning is when the court is divided 4-4, what happens is you affirm the lower court. So this delegates a lot of power to the lower courts because now we have a lot more en banc proceedings, and the lower courts, which I guess are more diverse and spread out, have a way of basically setting national, well, not quite national policy, but something awfully close to it.
Well, I want to respond to that because I think I forgot to list this as one of the, I only had 10 minutes, the pros of my proposal, which is currently we had 9 Supreme Court justices, all of whom educated at Harvard and Yale. One spent some time in Columbia. Except for Roberts, basically from the coast.
That's in between.
None of whom are public defenders. All, a couple of prosecutors, but it's incredibly non-diverse. If we relegate more decisions to the courts of appeals, we'll have hundreds of judges over 50 states representing 12, I'm sure hundreds of law schools, I would think, or many, many, many law schools. Diverse geographically, politically, educationally, in every way. Or you can have Justice Kennedy decide. Because since 2006, it turns out, since 2006, in 85% of 5-4 divided constitutional cases, Justice Kennedy has been in the majority.
He is our overlord.
He's been the overlord.
Yeah.
And I happen to, and I think it is, we consider a system where one person, I mean, we can go through the issues. Affirmative action, abortion, voting, free speech, freedom of religion,
gay marriage.
They're all Justice Kennedy.
My world.
I don't hate that world, but I don't love that world, but I don't know who the next median justice is going to be. And I might hate that world, and so might you.
Stephen Breyer's world sounds scary. It'll be very boring, though.
We should take questions.
You know, Breyer was asked by Kardashian. He said the alleged robberies, making the Supreme Court great again. So let's take some questions. In the back, sir.
Okay, in our circuit, guns outside of the home. In another circuit, and I crossed that line and got arrested for having a gun outside the home. Why have standing to sue the Senate?
Staying to sue the Senate?
What?
Why the Senate?
It's just
No.
But there's no obligation to appoint the justice. They have no affirmative obligation to do anything.
No, but I do want to point out state of the law across huge realms of criminal law is the state you live in.
Come to Texas. Well, yeah, now in the back.
One of them were retire or pass away.
7 is enough.
Like, is enough? Like, when you
The Supreme Court started off with 6.
You know how many voted in Marbury versus Madison?
5.
5. Marbury had 5 votes.
No, the answer to your question is, just as the Senate kept to a bipartisan agreement to live with the filibuster for over a century, I think, agree in a bipartisan way, no matter what the number is, it will always be even. We'll make it even, and it will always, always, always be evenly.
Eric, what do you think of a supermajority requirement?
I would love
now
it.
You need 2/3 to overturn a law.
I vote yes.
So I think, is it North Dakota or some state actually requires a Supreme Court to have a supermajority, so basically 6 out of 9 instead of 5 to 4.
I propose that. My book, I propose
Good plug. Yeah, in the back.
For, I mean, is that depoliticizing court, or is it? I mean, it's just going to keep along those lines until.
Well. I think we'll agree on this. The nomination process could not be more political than it is today.
It's pretty bad.
It's hard to imagine what that would look like. I do think there's some interesting dynamics at work here. If a Republican president has to nominate a Democratic justice, I think that's a good thing. But that and there'll be stealth judges, but that is true today as well. Remember, my solution is not perfect. It's just better than what we have today. That's all I have to prove to you. And I can't imagine anything more political, for example, than Justice Sotomayor, a person I respect. 3 months before her confirmation said, of course, being a Latina woman has a dramatic impact on how I judge cases. And then going in front of the entire country 3 months later and saying, I didn't mean, just kidding. And, I think, so it couldn't get, Justice Kagan herself wrote a law review article in 1990-something, process a charade. My system makes it less likely for it to be a charade. Might still be a charade, but less likely. You disagree with that?
I think, and I have a piece out with Randy Barnett called Restoring the Lost Confirmation, National Affairs, you can read it. Since the Bork nominations became progressively worse and worse and worse, and I see the current battle as maybe the latest manifestation of this intransigence. The other way, maybe Eric has a point. Maybe that there's been so much attention on the Supreme Court that if it's less important, the process will be depoliticized. But as long as the court is saying national policy for whatever else, that people will direct their attention to this target.
When Josh says setting national policy for gay rights and for gay marriage and voting rights, I agree the court did that for gay marriage. As to voting rights, absolutely deconstructed and destroyed a national policy agreed to by a unanimous Senate House and signed by President Bush.
Abortion, I agree. Be a better example. Yeah, yes, sir.
What would be the best way, in your opinion, to resolve some like controversial issues, such as like abortion or gay marriage, like where you have?
Why do we need to?
I'm saying, but if you have, if there's a 4-4 split, and you have people running to other states.
It's our country. Don't let Georgia move to Alaska.
No, they're not moving though. They're running away and then they're coming back and then they're retroactive.
I think Eric's point of view. So, is your point if you don't like the abortion laws in Texas, move to New York?
To some degree.
Whoa.
Yeah, but I'll tell you why I say that. No one is more pro-choice. I am the most pro-choice person you ever meet. Takes no issue. It is agnostic. At least as a matter of complicated debate about gender discrimination and women's rights. But that's not the terrain upon which Roe versus Wade or Casey were fought, or in the last case. A right to terminate a pregnancy. So it's not in the Constitution.
So let me build on Eric's point a bit. We are so accustomed to a world where 5 justices decide everything. It's difficult for people, and particularly law students. All you guys do is read cases, right? That's all you read. You read a majority dissent, okay, that's it. So we have state legislatures, and you're actually there. We are so damn accustomed to the court setting national policy that we're not even aware that, well, maybe if we wait another 2-3 years, we'd have gay marriage nationwide. Maybe 5 years, 10 years, right?
Absolutely, and I think from the perspective of someone who is pro-choice all the way down, I have argued many, many times was perhaps the biggest disaster ever to hit the left of any case in history. Because it was true in 1970 that rich women in cities could get abortions pretty easily. Poor women in cities, it was harder but not impossible. Poor women in rural areas could not get abortions and they were killing themselves. It's a horrible thing. That's still true today. Roe didn't change that by now. You're in South Dakota today, there's no clinics. You're in Mississippi today, there's one clinic. So Roe didn't help that. To Roe created Justice Scalia. Something.
Whoa. Yes, sir, in the back.
Limiting the Supreme Court to 8 justices would force Congress to take up and act on more of these things, or do you think that we would sort of say?
So Judge Richard Posner of the Seventh Circuit, he and I have had a lot of
They have a
talk.
man crushing each other.
He and I had a long talk about this. The Seventh Circuit knows today that 99% of their cases will never get to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court review out there is irrelevant to their daily life.
Especially Posner.
Especially Posner, right. But in the rare case, an affirmative action case, or an abortion case, or a campaign finance case, where they have a strong instinct that the case will go to the Supreme Court, circuit you have, I think, 12 or 13 judges. Politically, educationally, why is anybody convinced that the Supreme Court's a better institution than those? We have to have a national rule. I don't think we need a national rule on most of these questions.
So you're a federal society member, like federalism.
Society member before the whole judicial engagement thing. That's a different conversation.
Okay. I think there's another question.
Exactly.
Yes, sir.
The idea of taking strike people as radical because the idea of 9 sort of baked into our consciousness about what the court is and what it's supposed to do hasn't always been that way.
Germany's, by the way, I'm sorry, the German Supreme Court has 16 judges divided into 8 panels, even number, and it works great.
Already know how did the equilibrium come to
Congress passed a law, right?
Yeah, actually, for a brief period during the Civil War, there were 10 justices, and then they fixed the number at 9. Of course, the classic story of Roosevelt attempted a court pack, right? That you had these conservative justices who were trying to thwart his agenda. And rather than amend the Constitution, it would be easier to appoint a couple new justices. For everyone over the age of 70, we appoint a new one. That's a backlash to this that Roosevelt withdrew the plan and it failed. In fact, famously, Chief Justice Hughes wrote this letter on behalf of him and maybe 1 or 2 others saying, this is a bad idea. He'll accomplish what he wanted anyway.
Indulge me in a 3-minute story from that time period, 1869.
It's 1253, so you got
really, really highlight this. I think one of the most important legal court has ever decided, and we don't teach in law school, is whether Congress could issue paper money.
Oh, yeah.
It turns out the Constitution only talks about North prints paper money during the Civil War.
Legal.
Okay, there you go. But this was people were fighting about this in 1869.
Scott Jackson as well.
After the Civil War ended, the case got to the Supreme Court, and 5 judges in an unbelievably dramatic case, front page New York Herald, all that stuff, said Congress does not have the power to issue paper money. It's unconstitutional. The rich creditors were happy because they wanted to get paid in gold and silver. The poor debtors were unhappy. They wanted to pay back in greenbacks, is what they were called. Biggest case, I think, in history to that point in time, except for Dred Scott. Biggest case in history. And that day, they announced the decision, the justice resigns. He actually has 2 picks, so the court was shorthanded. He appoints 2 Republicans of his own political party. And a year later, 1 year, they reversed the second most important case in the Supreme Court history, saying basically nothing has changed. Nothing is new. We just agree with the. That's not law. Right? No law changed. President, I think, did the right thing. Republican president appointing Republican justices for one purpose and one purpose only, by the way. It was the biggest case in history, other than Dred Scott. And they did. The court is supposed to do. And with 8, it'll be much harder to do it.
We have maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
Speaking about money on that topic, do you think that it is constitutional that we have a Federal Reserve System that prints our money instead of
All yours. Where's Ron Paul when you need him?
Nowhere. That's interesting, isn't it?
The of our modern administrative state from the Fed on down is inconsistent with the original meaning of the Constitution.
It's probably not. And I never got too much into that. It's too right wing conspiracy. I'm only the shallow end of the right wing conspiracy.
I think the size of the administrative state post New Deal is something the court had. Even Scalia, and they know they can't change all of society, and I think no judge would hold that in today's day and age. It could change, but I think it's something.
I'd like his theory, so it's full David.
Andy.
But so Nixon had 4 appointees to the court. We're looking at several justices probably having to retire.
You will live forever.
Why replace any of them? Like, why isn't this an argument against our entire court?
You mean get rid of the court altogether? The Constitution requires the Supreme Court, but you can control the jurisdiction. It's only what the original jurisdiction.
You can have the Senate not appoint any members.
So I think Josh is the right way to say it. I also think it's a great idea. We should go one of 2 ways with it. If they're going to be lawyers pretending to do law, they should do law, and they should overturn very little. I'm in favor, and you, as a libertarian, you might be too. I'm in favor of a council of wise people with a veto over the other 2 branches of government.
Gladiator, thumbs up.
Yes, that's what Kennedy does. I mean, he was literally in his chambers before the case to overturn Roe. He voted to overturn it in 1989.
He changed his mind.
When there were 4 votes. When there were 5 votes, he sat in his office, applauded this, and agonized, and really didn't know what he was going to do. And it was not much more complicated than.
This is the man in charge of our lives, right? This is the wise elder. Do we already have a council of elders?
No.
Tony and Nino and then Sam and
So the answer is, I think a Supreme Court's a good idea. They should do less, or they shouldn't be all lawyers.
Yes, we need to have citizen jurors on the Supreme Court. Maybe one more question.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.
Great stuff.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for coming, everyone. If you want to be on our email list and you're not already, you guys can sign up here, grab a fucking Constitution, and get more food before you leave. Thank you so much for coming.